Well, good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started with our regulation panel, and hope everybody had a good lunch in the neighborhood. Portland is a great foodie town, and we're happy to show that off. This panel will examine the state of regulation in this post-network new media environment in which things are changing so quickly. So we have presentations from two scholars and then a regulatory official and scholar and law teacher as well, David Olson from our Office of Community Technology here in Portland. So we'll have presentations of roughly 15 minutes or so apiece, and then we'll throw it open for conversation with you all. So again, thanks for coming, and we'll begin with Caryn Murphy of the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, presenting on showing a little skins, content regulation in the post-network area, the post-network era, and you'll notice that the screen has been blocked because some of the images may be a bit risque.
That's, yeah, the promise that there may be images that are risque, I can't live up to that necessarily. I brought you a few images because I thought it's a little bit more interesting. I encourage you to scan for them. Yesterday, the USA Today reported that ABC has two upcoming series that include the word bitch in the title, and that would be Don't Trust the Bitch in Apartment 23 and Good Christian Bitches. In both cases, ABC has reduced the word bitch to the letter B. It's acceptable broadcast content standards in this day and age to use the word bitch, but ABC is apparently acknowledging that there is going to be a strand of resistance. There are going to be those in the audience who are made to feel uncomfortable by it, and so they're playing a little game by hiding the word in the title, alluding to it, and not using it outright. This was of interest to me. I do historical research on 1960s broadcast content standards. And in 1965, an ABC censor asked for the word tramp to be removed from a script because, quote, no lady is a tramp on ABC TV. And in 2012, you can draw your own conclusions. On any given night, primetime programming on ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, and the CW incorporates adult language, violence, mature content in relation to sex and sexuality, even and perhaps especially in sitcoms that theoretically target family viewing. Indecency regulation has been an issue of contention for much of the past decade, and it is not my intent to make the case that we need to have greater content restrictions. I don't want to argue that. Instead, I want to demonstrate that the relatively passive solution that has been employed in the industry of self-regulation has been rendered irrelevant due to present-day conditions. Broadcast networks, and to a lesser extent cable channels, have historically been motivated to regulate themselves in response to external pressures from a number of key factors. My central claim is that these factors no longer function to affect the decision-making of broadcast networks. While broadcast regulation has been justified by the FCC as a necessity in service of the public interest, cable regulation has not been advanced in the same way. And as I discuss my two case studies, one is broadcast and one is cable, and I want to get into the tensions a little bit there in terms of the rules being different in one area than they are in the other. In the post-network environment, the changes that have occurred in terms of programming and technology have diminished the efficacy of the pressures that motivated television companies to regulate themselves. I briefly discussed the changes to the media environment before offering an overview of the factors that have historically influenced self-regulation in order to demonstrate that these factors are no longer relevant in contemporary times. I offer two brief case studies of recent controversies over content in broadcast and cable environments. And as these controversies have played out over the period of about the last 12 months, it became clear that in the contemporary media environment, the responsibility for regulating content has shifted from the producer to the television viewer. In terms of how the post-network era has changed in technology and programming, there are a few things that I sort of want you to have in mind as I talk about my case studies. First and primarily, I think most of us consider a lot and are thinking about television, the ways that users have more control than they ever had previously in terms of being able to watch programming on demand or online or via any number of alternatives to watching programming as it airs live with commercials. There is an increased amount of user control, so digital video recorders, online access to content, etc. In addition, a changing factor in the post-network era has been the expansion of satellite alternatives, and people tend to conceptualize this in terms of the ways that it has changed radio. That subscription-based satellite radio service allowed for radio content to really open up and not be in any way hampered by FCC restrictions on obscenity and indecency. And in some ways, the availability of subscription content then pushes the envelope for content providers that are not subscription-based to be able to compete. And then sort of tying this together, as the media environment has split off in a million different directions, niche programming, the idea that programming, even on broadcast channels, is targeting relatively small audiences, certainly much, much smaller than audiences 20 years ago. From the standpoint of broadcasters and from the standpoint of cable channels, they're looking to appeal to small pieces of the pie instead of creating programming that's palatable to broad swaths of the overall audience. The philosophy of self-regulation dictates that if left alone, media industries will regulate themselves in order to ensure their commercial potential. And I'm not exactly talking about free market philosophy here. I mean, in terms of the way that the network structure has existed, forces within that network structure, including the threat of government regulation, have encouraged broadcasters to toe the line in terms of content. The philosophy of self-regulation says that broadcasters and to some extent cable channels are motivated to regulate themselves to compete with other companies within their industry. The principles of self-regulation argue that media companies will regulate themselves in order to serve their audience's interest, and this, by extension, theoretically serves a larger public interest. The idea is that broadcasters want to reach as wide an audience as possible, and so they will cast their nets wide to capture an audience, essentially serving the public interest through this process. And there are certain forces that act upon the market and act upon media industries in particular, motivating broadcasters to regulate themselves. And I would say the first of these factors is the threat of FCC interference. And I don't mean in terms of broadcasters airing indecent content and then being fined by the FCC. I mean the existence of FCC regulations that networks keep in mind as they strategize, as they create their programming in the first place. The second major factor, and this is something I will get into with more detail in my case studies. The second major factor is the possibility of affiliates' refusal of clearance. And historically, the idea that a broadcast television affiliate could refuse to clear a program if they believe it will put them in a precarious position in terms of regulation enforcement has been a factor that has affected how networks conceptualize the kind of programming that they're going to develop and air. The third factor is pressure from sponsors and advertisers. Sponsors and advertisers are the major source of revenue for broadcasters, and they can exert their influence to change the content of television programming. The threat that advertisers will pull funding from programming is serious, and historically has led to situations in which shows with no advertising have been canceled due to that factor, due to that reason. And that's why it works so effectively as a motivator. Networks are trying to create programming that pleases both audiences and advertisers. The fourth factor is pressure from public advocacy groups, and this is the idea that public advocacy groups might protest a show's content or boycott a show's advertisers. And probably the major advocacy group that I'm going to discuss is the Parents Television Council, and it's probably nationwide the most well-known of these groups. It's certainly not the only one, but it is the group that has become the most associated with attempts to exert pressure on broadcast content. And finally, the fifth factor is that broadcasters are motivated to regulate themselves in the commercial interests of their parent companies. And this is a factor for cable channels as well. Every major network, every cable channel is owned by a major media conglomerate. It's in these companies' interests to present their parent company in the best light possible. In terms of talking a little bit about where things are going with the FCC, I know that our next panelist is going to discuss the FCC and I believe their current Supreme Court case in more detail. And so I don't want to get into a ton of detail here. I just want to set forth a couple of baseline ideas. Fox versus the FCC, the Supreme Court case that is currently under consideration, is a case in which Fox television stations are arguing that indecency standards are too vague to be enforceable, that it's too hard to distinguish artistic and cultural works from gratuitous nudity and coarse language. The line is, where is it? It's just so blurry, right? 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. has been the protected time period in which broadcasters are responsible for monitoring indecency under the justification that broadcasters are private companies that must operate in the public interest. In the current case, justices sympathize with the FCC in the interests of parents and kids. Because of the change in the landscape, they're working to protect the idea that broadcasting should be a safe haven where parents know their kids won't be bombarded with curse words or nudity. And what I find most interesting about the Fox versus the FCC discussion is the incredibly small amount of territory that they're attempting to protect. And that means in terms of indecency, to maintain rules that broadcasters can't use the S word or the F word or show nudity. And literally, it's put forth that directly, that is the indecency territory that they are attempting to protect that is under contention. A ruling is expected before the term ends in June, but even with a ruling that reaffirms the FCC's right to levy fines for indecent content, the broadcast environment will have no motivation to make significant changes, and that's what I want to look at in terms of my two case studies. The first case study that I want to share with you is NBC's series, The Playboy Club, that they aired for 3 episodes this last fall. And I have some images and things for you to look at and consider as I talk. When NBC announced that it would premiere The Playboy Club, and this was last spring, it was largely interpreted in the popular press as an attempt to capitalize on the success of AMC's Mad Men. Like Mad Men, The Playboy Club is an hour-long drama set in the early 1960s, theoretically offering a nostalgic appeal for viewers. And it began to get interesting when, counter to this prevailing narrative, The Playboy Club is about early 60s nostalgia, an NBC affiliate in Salt Lake City announced that they would refuse to clear The Playboy Club for air in their market. This was reported as national news. The station's objection wasn't necessarily taken very seriously by NBC or by any of the major press outlets, but their argument was, rather than seeing it as a new iteration of Mad Men, they viewed it as advertising for pornography, which is an interesting claim. The station's stance was that the show served to advertise Playboy Enterprises as a brand, and it's a claim that is backed up by the fact that Playboy Enterprises licensed the show. Hugh Hefner provided voiceover narration for the first episode. And in addition, Playboy Enterprises had media representatives who were giving interviews about their intention to capitalize on the popularity of the show should it become popular. And so, for example, Playboy Enterprises announced plans to open new Playboy clubs. The chain had long been defunct. Even in Chicago, where it was originally based, there hadn't been a Playboy club since the 1980s. But they're announcing 2012 plans to reopen Playboy clubs across the country. The company produced an issue of Playboy magazine to tie in with the premiere of the show, offering them at the vintage price of 60 cents per copy and announcing their intent to sell out a run of 500,000 issues. The affiliate that refused to clear the program was not incorrect. Representatives from Playboy Enterprises spoke openly about the ways that the series could benefit the long-term profitability of this adult entertainment corporation. And in response, NBC, and I have to say, many journalists kind of laughed off the concerns of the Salt Lake City affiliate, and that's quoted as Mormon and very conservative, right? Kind of laughed it off. And NBC developed a strategy of promoting their series as being about women's empowerment because the early 1960s narratives of feminism coincide so well with the Playboy Club and its history. But broadcast networks are no longer required to take the concerns of the affiliate seriously because broadcast networks are no longer dependent on their affiliates. They don't have to worry about their content concerns. When this NBC affiliate refused to clear the program, another local affiliate, a My Network TV station, stepped in. If that station hadn't stepped in, viewers in Salt Lake City would have been able to access the show via Hulu, via NBC.com, via iTunes, via Amazon, just to name a few. Although a couple of the options would have required viewers to purchase episodes, NBC.com and Hulu made the episodes available for free. Let's say, hypothetically, a large number of affiliates would have said, it's hard for us to make a public interest justification of advertising for Playboy in primetime television. Let's say it was a large number of affiliates. In response, NBC Universal could have re-aired episodes on the cable channels that they own that have national coverage, and that would include the USA Network and Bravo. Affiliates' refusal of clearance would not have prevented the show from being available to the national audience, and thus the network had no real motivation to take the affiliates' concerns seriously. NBC promoted the series as a crime drama that would be more soap opera than softcore, but all of the lead actors signed contracts with nudity clauses, leaving open the possibility that the series could push the envelope in depictions of sex or eventually release a more graphic version of the series on DVD. The series drew scrutiny from public interest groups, including the Parents Television Council, and this is what the Parents Television Council was posting online in order to mobilize their membership and get people responding about the potential airing of the show. The anti-pornography group Morality and Media is also heavily involved in this, and you can see that that involves some of the same leadership of the Parents Television Council that are referenced up here in the text. The PTC charged NBC with using publicly owned airwaves to make pornography mainstream, and they alerted that pressure on affiliates might be more effective than angry letters to the network. The PTC worked to put these claims forward in an approachable way, and so that their membership who interacts with them through online interfaces can kind of easily click and submit a letter, et cetera, et cetera. The PTC also exerted a lot of pressure on advertisers, asking advertisers, national brands associated with the show, to pull their sponsorship from the show. What is interesting about that aspect of the story is that after the first episode premiere, which was not very high rated, it didn't do very well in terms of Nielsen ratings, a number of national sponsors did leave the show, and that includes Sprint and Kraft. However, they also released statements stating that they weren't leaving the show due to pressure from the Parents Television Council. They were leaving the show to explore other options in the fall television season, and they may well return should Playboy Club, suddenly start to improve in ratings. They may well return to it. It wasn't a content concern. It was more of a business concern. And what is fascinating about that, there seems to be a level of exhaustion with Parents Television Council protests. There's the expectation that any time content is in the least objectionable, the PTC will launch a protest that looks something like this. And that seems to have become its own reason to ignore what they say in almost every case. Okay, let me move on to my cable case study. Let's talk a little bit about Skins. Skins aired on MTV as a full season from January 2011 for about 10 episodes. And from the beginning, this was a controversial series for MTV. It's an import from the UK, and in the UK it aired on British pay television. It was explicit in its content. Cable channels do not have to abide by FCC indecency and obscenity regulations, but they are still theoretically subject to outside pressures. In the case of Skins, even before it premiered, there were pressures from the Parents Television Council, and you can see it's very, very similar to the form that they put forward for the Playboy Club. There were pressures from the Parents Television Council, and as the series premiered to primarily low ratings, the Parents Television Council stepped up their efforts by communicating directly with advertisers for the show, who after a few episodes, for the most part, pulled out. And the PTC took the heretofore unprecedented move of communicating with Viacom shareholders and arguing that MTV is part of Viacom. Viacom is a corporation that depends on its stock value, and that Skins was having a negative effect on shareholders' interests, and thus they should lobby MTV to cancel the show. What's fascinating about the case is that even with low ratings and no advertiser support, MTV didn't cancel the show. They aired the entire season of it. They withstood the pressure that was coming not just from the Parents Television Council, but other public interest groups, and apparently claimed a justification in terms of how it fit into their overall program strategy and their audience target. And what these cases kind of offer is a very contemporary window into how broadcast and cable channels make their decisions about what to air. And what public advocacy groups are asking for is a greater acknowledgement from the outset that programming is going to be accessible to general audiences. And what broadcast and cable channels are moving towards is less and less of that acknowledgement. So let me wrap up there, and I'm happy to talk more about this in Q&A.
Be up here, or
I don't have a
Jason Zenor now from the State University of New York at Oswego, as we swap presentations, and I'll set the mic up here, and here's the bleep has hit the fan. The state of FCC indecency policies in the new media world order. I guess I could have said the word, right? You're not subject to regulation in this context.
Well, we're being streamed online, but we're not going to be on TV, so we're all set. I may actually drop a few F-bombs, so hopefully if you are, I want to warn you, if you are easily offended, you can leave now, but I'll try my best not to go too far on that. My name is Jason Zenor. I am a professor at SUNY-Oswego. I teach and research primarily in media law. So what I want to talk about today is the current case that is at the Supreme Court, the FCC versus Fox, and talk about the arguments on both sides of the issue and sort of the precedent and the build-up for the case, and then a little bit about what's actually on the TV landscape and if the arguments sort of hold true still today and what we're trying to figure out here at the conference and what's really going on TV in 2012. All right, so if you're not aware, there is a big decision coming up at the Supreme Court, and as Caryn had said, it should be within the next couple of months that the Supreme Court will come out with its opinion. And it's been a build-up to this case for about 10 years now. It started back in 2003 with the Janet Jackson incident at the Super Bowl, where they had a wardrobe malfunction. And since then, that was during the Bush administration, and the FCC began to crack down on indecency on television, and then the broadcasters quickly brought it to court and challenged it, and it's been floating around and it's gone back in a few different times. So I want to sort of put that preview there. And where we are today in 2012 is whether or not the entire indecency scheme that's been set up by the FCC and Congress is constitutional. And that could be the decision. It may not be. They may sort of use a classic overbroad, vague decision, which was put us back in sort of the spiral we're in right now. So, but it could overturn 75 years of content regulation, which some of us on the free speech side have been arguing for a while. All right, so a little bit of the precedent, the law behind it. It all starts with the COMM Act in 1934. That's the authority. That's where the FCC got its authority from the Congress, and there are specific laws that say that the FCC, in trying to promote the public interest, and that the broadcasters must serve the public interest, that they can actually, the FCC can regulate indecency and obscenity, and they can fine people. Actually, the law says they can actually throw people in jail for indecency. It doesn't happen, but they can do that. So the FCC indecency regulation has been around for a long time, and in the early years, of course, our culture was different. They didn't really have to apply it too much because the networks basically sort of followed it. When we get to the 1970s, that's when things start to change, and we have the very famous Pacifica versus the FCC, 1978. And if you're not familiar with this, the 7 Dirty Words case, where George Carlin's monologue was broadcast on radio. That was challenged, and actually the FCC found that it was indecent. They didn't fine Pacifica, but Pacifica, as sort of free speech trailblazers, decided to challenge it, went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And what happened? The Supreme Court came back and said that the FCC indecency rules are constitutional. And that was what we had for about 30 years. We get to the Bush administration after the wardrobe malfunction, and we get a change in the rules when the FCC decides that it would start to punish fleeting expletives. And this is the idea that a live show, it's unscripted, where somebody doesn't work for the network might drop an F-bomb or maybe expose themselves. In the case of Janet Jackson, it was unplanned and it wasn't gratuitous, or I shouldn't say gratuitous, it wasn't excessive, then the FCC would not fine them. Well, after 2003, after the Super Bowl incident, they do change the rule on that and decide they would start fining stations if this happened. So the Fox stations decide that they would challenge the FCC, had fined them for an incident on the 2002 and 2003 Billboard Awards. In one case, Cher was accepting an award, and she said that basically the music industry had been predicting her death for a long time, and basically they can all F off, is what she said. And in a similar incident next year, it was Nicole Richie, who was famous at the time, still is, but she was very famous for being on A Simple Life. Her and Paris Hilton were up on the stage, and she was talking about getting cow shit in her Pradas. And basically, you can't call that the fucking Simple Life, is what she said. And obviously, it wasn't planned. I don't know if they were trying to get some publicity, probably. But those were the two incidences in which they were fined for. In 2006, Congress passed a new act, a new Broadcasting Decency Act, which allowed for the FCC to increase their fines by tenfold, from $32,000 up to $325,000, and up to $3 million for any single show. And if you are a major corporate owner of stations, that can add up very quickly to tens of millions of dollars. So they obviously had an incentive to challenge this. So in the 2009 case, what had happened was the Second Circuit decided whether or not the FCC had the ability to change their rules. In 2003, the Second Circuit said no. It was an arbitrary and capricious decision, and that was challenged by the FCC. FCC versus Fox went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that the FCC could change their rules. That was within the Administrative Procedure Act. There was no problem there. But they said they had some concerns about the constitutionality of the entire indecency scheme. So they sent it back down to the Second Circuit to decide that. And in 2010, the Second Circuit said, well, we have a problem here. This seems to be unconstitutional, or at the very least vague and overbroad. And that's the current case that is in the Supreme Court. So we had oral arguments in January. I'll wait to talk about what happened at the oral arguments, but just sort of look at the arguments that the two sides have. The FCC arguments all stem from the Pacifica case in 1978. And at that time, what the Supreme Court said was, already spoke about that, Congress gave authority to the FCC. They can do this. It's specific laws inside the Telecom Act, or the Com Act of 1934. But the other argument was that, sort of twofold, the idea that for the broadcast airwaves, there's scarcity. And that's why the FCC was initially given authority, that they'd have to come in, step in, and make sure that frequencies, there was a lot of noise or too many people there on the air, so they started giving licenses. Right? And in giving licenses, it was decided that the airwaves belong to the public and not the corporations who own the licenses. And because of that, they have to serve the public interest. So because part of the public interest is making sure that there's not too much profanity on TV or too much sex on TV, that allowed for the FCC to regulate indecency. The other part was the pervasiveness, the idea that there are only 3 networks. It was sort of beamed into your house, and any defenseless viewer could consume this. We had to protect their privacy, and so in that case, the FCC was allowed to broadcast or to regulate indecency. And then, of course, there's always children in the media, which is always concerned. Make sure we're protecting those poor children who've never heard these words before, or know anything about sexuality. So if they saw it on TV, what would happen to their poor brains? So the ban was on excretory functions or sexual organs and any sort of frontal nudity, especially male nudity. And then the other part was that it was not a complete ban. We have the safe harbor hours from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. thus not a complete ban on speech, and therefore was not unconstitutional. That's the FCC's argument still today, based on the Pacifica case. All right. So as far as the broadcasters, well, their first argument is always sort of free speech violation, but that doesn't necessarily hold up with the Supreme Court always. Since there's this precedent of treating broadcasters differently, just sort of a pure free speech argument does not work, but they still make that argument. There is the ambiguity and vagueness, and that's what most prognosticators think is going to happen for the 2012 case in a couple months. They're going to come back and say that it's overly broad or vague, and the FCC has to go back to the drawing board. And then whenever you have something that's overly broad or vague, of course, you have a chilling effect, because if you're not sure what you can say, then you're going to cut out a lot more than you have to, and therefore that's a prohibition on your free speech. All right, then some of the other arguments which show that maybe Pacifica is outdated is the stuff we've been talking about already today, is that technology has changed. As Caryn had said, it's not 90% of people and households that have TV watching the same 3 networks. There's such fragmentation that people are over the place, and it's not as pervasive as it once was. And people no longer get it over the airways. 90% of people get it from satellites or cable. So this idea that it's this defenseless consumer is also outdated. And then after that, if you're going online, you're watching it on DVR, things like the safe harbor hours don't even matter anymore, because you can watch it any time of the day, so it's not really as if children are protected. Then we have the idea of self-regulation. If we have 3 broadcast networks, or 4 with Fox, and then we have hundreds of cable channels that all self-regulate, and not every show on TV is Sopranos or True Blood, then are we really that concerned if we let the broadcasters say what they want or show what they want, that they will, every other word will be the F word on NBC, CBS, or ABC. And then add to that, our culture has changed. The idea that kids are somehow defenseless, maybe sort of idealistic, and I'm sure a lot of the conversations that kids have on the playground are a lot worse than you hear on TV. And with the internet, if you can figure out how to, what the year you're born is, make you over 18, you can easily access material that's a lot worse than you'll ever see even on cable TV. And the power of the F word is no longer the same. As one commentator said, now it takes several F words to get to the power of one F word. And most of us don't even use it in sort of as a sexual word anymore, right? It's used as an adjective or an adverb, more of an emotive word than it is sort of describing a sexual function. So our culture has definitely changed. So I wanted to quickly look at what's on TV, and I went and looked at content analysis of the TV landscape. And as far as profanities are concerned, people believe that there's too much indecency across the board, but numbers don't necessarily show it. As far as the 7 dirty words on broadcast, you never see it or hear them. And on cable, the content analysis only 4.5 times per hour across cable. And most of that's implied. In other words, it's bleeped out. We all know what they're saying, but it's not a direct use, and that's, of course, self-regulated. Cable compared to broadcast, you look at not the 7 dirty words, but other sort of profane words. It's not that big a difference between cable and broadcast right now. As far as sexuality, there is a lot more sexuality on TV, but there's a lot of sexuality on TV, but there's not much the FCC can do about it, because broadcast can get around it by using euphemisms or different words, or they'll show a sex scene and have a certain angle where you don't actually see any nudity. That's all over TV, and the FCC is not even regulating that right now because they can't. They can only really attack the 7 dirty words. And then I think is most interesting is TV violence. There is no regulation of TV violence, self-regulation with the ratings and the V-chip, but the FCC does not step in. And if you look at a lot of the social science research, violence has a greater effect. Maybe the FCC wants to, but they don't. And the United States Supreme Court is sort of dismissive of social science. And there was a case last summer, Brown versus EMA, where they overturned a California law which restricted sales of violent video games to kids because that it would block access of legal material to adults. But sex is a little different. We have this long history of obscenity and indecency, and courts are always slow to overturn laws and precedents. So maybe they are going to come back and say it was overly broad and vague, but sort of sum up closing arguments. Pacifica is certainly outdated, as we can all know, because of technology, and it seems as if the indecency enforcements are futile because there's so much sex and violence and other words on TV, and just sort of picking these 7 dirty words seems sort of odd. And finally, the current Supreme Court has expanded free speech protections. We have the video game case I told you about. We have the Westboro Baptist Church. They allowed for that church group to protest outside funerals. They have the Citizen United, where they expanded corporate free speech. You have the Stevens versus United States, where they upheld the constitutionality of viewing animal crush films where people crush animals. Yet, you can't say the word tits on TV. It just seems sort of odd that they would uphold that. In the last 3 years, they've expanded free speech. So. All right, thank you very much.
WTF. All right. Oh, sorry, that was gratuitous. That was fleeting and gratuitous. David Olson joins us now.
Maybe, since I don't have PowerPoint, maybe we should all just circle up to the table and then we can go right to questions afterwards.
Absolutely. All right. David Olson, Director of the Office of Community Technology here in Portland, where he has been for more than 25 years. In that role, David advises the Portland City Council on communications and broadband matters, oversees cable, telecom, and utility franchises for the city, and serves as staff director for the Mount Hood Cable Regulatory Commission, a citizen body which handles cable regulatory matters for Portland and 5 other local governments. He's past president of the National Association of Telecom Officers and Advisors, so the national regulatory group, and also teaches this stuff as an adjunct faculty member at Lewis and Clark Law School here in Portland, where he teaches comm law. David,
Thanks very much, and gosh, thanks for inviting me and us to be represented. I love hearing this from the academic side. I mostly talk to lawyers and communications companies, so it's nice to get out in the real world where people are actually doing this stuff. And when I teach telecom law up at the law school, this subject is just one of the hot paper topics. They just love to write papers about this. In fact, I brought one by my student, Ashley Boyle. I have to give her credit, who led with Nicole Ritchie's statement as the title of her paper, which we might get back to. Nicole Ritchie's statement was rather famous because it was a twofer. It wasn't just a single word. It was she got 2 in, and that was sort of new and different at the time. But let me step back from that because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. I'm a lawyer, and more importantly, I'm a regulator. I'm on the regulatory side of this stuff. Though local government, thank God, doesn't have content control over media, the FCC does, and we get content questions all the time on the cable, regarding the cable access channels, regarding all kinds of things that go on, and we have to deal with them. In fact, I think I believe it was my first day in the office, which was then the Office of Cable Communications before we retitled it. In 1983, I think my second phone call was from an irate citizen complaining that TCI was going to start carrying the Playboy channel. And I was furious. That had just recently been announced. My third call right afterwards was from a guy complaining the cable company on the other side of the river was not carrying the Playboy channel. And thus it goes. Thus it goes in content issues. These are always hot button issues. The main thing in the legal context, and I'm always kind of living in the statute, that the FCC, please understand this, and this has been well covered, but nothing obscene can be carried on most any media here, but the FCC regulates indecency, and that's stuff that's not obscene. Okay, it's not obscene. The FCC regulates indecency, quote unquote indecency, under Chapter 18 of the U.S. Code, regulates indecency on broadcast television and radio only. Indecency is perfectly legal, as the papers here showed, is perfectly legal on cable. Indecency is perfectly legal on satellite. Indecency is perfectly legal on the internet. Indecency is perfectly legal on internet protocol television, on microwave, on WiMAX, on your it does, anything else. You can be as indecent as you want, and as much as you want, and as often as you want. But on broadcast television only, the FCC regulates indecency, which is things that are not obscene. They are merely indecent. And what's interesting in this whole area is that the arc of regulation of this stuff, you would think, given the history of the court cases, that government involvement in content would have started to decline after the 60s. Logically, you'd think it would, because some of these early cases, and even the George Carlin, the Pacifica case, came out in a period when broadcast dominated all media. We know this. And in the 80s, we had cable TV roar into life and start to begin to dominate. In the 90s, we had satellite delivery, smaller dishes that would get another alternative source of programming to you. By the time the 2000s rolled around, we had workable video coming over the internet once the internet went high speed. So in every decade, we have had more the explosion of media coming at you and a variety of other ways to get this stuff, and absolutely no content control on this other stuff in terms of indecency. But the FCC has held on to the indecency regulation on broadcast only, nothing else, and it's good law to this day. We will see if it's good law in a couple months when the Fox case is decided. This is very interesting because the courts were otherwise throwing out a bunch of broadcast-only doctrines throughout the 80s. The fairness doctrine. Oh, well, you can't require broadcasters to air, different sides of an issue. That's against the First Amendment. Why are we doing that with all this explosion of outlets? So in all areas other than indecency, this stuff has been going away. But in indecency, at the same time the media has exploded, the FCC has gotten more and more interested in it. The arc of regulation, instead of declining, has increased. There is no other media where that's happened. A general regulatory philosophy is if you have competition and many outlets, there's less and less need for government regulation. Okay? You don't need to regulate where there's a market. You don't need to regulate where people have choices. You don't need the government to intrude. You don't need, on the telephone side, we know that. Cellular, we know that. Internet, we know that. It doesn't happen here. In this issue, it is absolutely opposite that it is all those other media. And that regulatory philosophy, get the government out of the way when there's multiple outlets, simply doesn't work here. Isn't that interesting? And here, that indecency standard applies to broadcasters. There are 200 million plus television households in this country. Any idea how many of them elect to receive broadcast signals and TV in their native format? It's a fraction. It's less than 20%. Everybody else is buying them through the other media or getting them by other means. So all this applies to protect those people fractionally, getting it in their native format. It's very interesting, the arc of this. And I want to say, because it's so unusual that it works this way, I want to suggest to you a couple reasons for that, and a couple reasons why I'll just be a devil's advocate. And my students tell me, it's going to be reversed. My students tell me First Amendment will apply. They're finally going to give First Amendment to broadcasters here. And so I'll make this bet. Everybody tells me the Supreme Court has no place to hide. They're going to throw out this stuff. And I will say, not a chance. Not a chance. Because look at what's happened on this issue. The regulation has gotten more intensive, not less, on this. Why is that? Interesting. All the other circuits scattered around the USA, Ninth Circuit, Second Circuit, has thrown these out. in the other circuit courts of appeals, they've thrown this out on First Amendment grounds. I will point out those circuit courts of appeals are not located in Washington, D.C. And the Supreme Court is. The Supreme Court is. And you may have heard that inside the Beltway, there are politics inside the Beltway. I know there's going to be a terrible surprise to you. And I will also point out that Congress, in its wisdom, has spent 15 years forbidding obscenity on the Internet, and the courts for 15 years have been throwing out everything Congress passed on that subject. There is no law forbidding obscenity as well as indecency on the Internet in the USA as I speak. And you can ask a congressman, why do you keep passing those laws? Why? Because they're all unconstitutional. Any congressman will tell you, if they're honest and they've had a couple of drinks, nobody ever lost an election passing a law against dirty words and bad content. Nobody. And if you're concerned about constitutionality, my friend, that is not my job. It's the guys across the street in the Supreme Court. That's their job. That's not my job. And that's the pressure cooker we're in here. I would say let's remind ourselves television and broadcast is a hot medium. It's not books. We did Ulysses. We did books. We protected those. It's a hot medium. People care about it. And they're concerned about it. And nobody ever lost an election about it. And as the FCC has arced up its regulation on broadcasting, which is received by a tiny fraction of the people left in the United States, it's just going to keep pace. And Congress here is raising the ante to what, $3 million now for these things. It's not. It's jail. You can lose your license. You can lose your business if you let this stuff pass. And there's hardly any election in the world that's going to get lost if you choose to introduce a bill on this. So my bet, I think, indecency regulation in Fox is going to be just fine. And I think my good friend Justice Scalia is going to lead the charge. Okay? That's all I have. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dave. Well, let's open it up.
I think part of the whole indecency is the fact that you can't unknow something. You can't unring the bell, once the hearing is dead. And, like, for example, I was listening to a presentation based on things like this. And the question, I didn't know that, and now I can't unknow that. I can't unknow that. I will have nightmares thanks to you, JC. So, so I think that's part of it, and I think that's a very strong part of it. It's not so much what kids hear, their parents in their own homes dropping the F-bomb, S-bomb, and everything else, and sometimes combining them in new and interesting ways. It's the fact that people feel that there's a certain age to hear it outside the home or be able to understand it within a cultural context. And if the FCC and broadcasters come to an agreement about that it's not necessarily about the word and how necessarily it's presented in a cultural context, I think it would be a lot more honest and a lot more integrity. There's certain ways of relating to people that don't want children to know for certain stages of age.
I think your point is correct that it's protecting children, but I mean, it's four stations and some minor broadcast stations compared to thousands of cable channels, video on demand. Right? I mean, if parents, the argument would be, parents should be there, have their kids, watch Netflix and watch Nickelodeon on cable and not go on the internet. And then there's a V chip that's mandated by Congress since 2000. There's a rating system, so there's plenty of things in place to help parents out if they need it. And I think any other medium, this has been what the Supreme Court has said, whether it be video games or the internet. In those cases where the laws that were passed in the late 90s to block indecency on the internet, that's what the Supreme Court has said. But somehow it's different for broadcasters. And I think you bring up a very important point that it's probably not going to be overturned because they're just reluctant to overturn precedents, and they're probably going to send it back and say that's vague and overbroad, and maybe that's probably what the Supreme Court is saying is FCC needs to figure this out and make it clearer for broadcasters as to what is indecent and what's not. Anybody else?
Hi, thank you for what you said. A comment. David, this thing about why it's not going to be overturned, I'm just wondering if you had a thought about this. When it was first put in place, it's because broadcasting was pervasive and prominent, and now it's a tiny part of the universe. My students have no idea what broadcast network is, ever. They have no idea.
No rabbit ears. What's that? Rabbit ears go on a rabbit.
They don't know what the difference is at all, and so they don't choose their programming based on that.
Right.
But one of the arguments to maintain it is to keep it safe haven. Well, there are plenty of cable networks for children's programs that actually are safe haven for preventing children from committing violence or sex abuse. So what I'm wondering too is part of this actually a reaction against the fact that the media environment is so much more colorful, shall we say?
Well,
and the broadcasters are being specifically targeted because the rest of the media environment is so much less.
I would say you hit the nail on the head. The saturation, as shown in the statistics you put up, the saturation of bad content, on the media now, as your slide showed, people react to it, and they want to say, well, at least you can go one place, and maybe not. I think you're right. I think it is very reactive, and that's one of the several reasons why I think this is going to be upheld.
The broadcasters feel like a competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis cable networks.
Yeah.
Because of this, but then they integrated into cable, so now it doesn't matter as much. But they're still taking this position of having to pay the price for what all the cable networks do.
It's also a competitive advantage because they can say, we're clean, they're not. And a lot of folks will respond.
And if I add to that, I think it's the pressures politically, as you had mentioned, and that one stat was that more than half of people think there's too much indecency on television, and you teach at a law school, and so you're talking to kids that want to be lawyers. When I talk to my students in broadcasting, the idea that the broadcasting regulations will be gone tomorrow, it blows their mind. This is how it's always been. How can this change? So I think a lot of it is that is that tradition that we hold on to. And the same thing with the courts. They love traditions.
Does the audience actually differentiate between obscenity and indecency?
It's indecent. Some of the stuff I see on the news is positively indecent. It's not obscene.
The statute says the FCC can assess penalties on obscene, indecent, or profane language in broadcast. Every single one of those has a different definition you'll love to know. Obscene, indecent, and profane all have a whole series of legal definitions about what they are. And you know what? Your average person on the street has no clue. But the lawyers in my class, the other folks, they like that stuff. Okay, but it's I don't say for Joe Sixpack, it's not. It's too nuanced.
And I mean, in the United States, there's not much that what you really have is the regulation, and pornography. People go that word around too. Most people have no idea the legal terminology.
Okay, we'll go there, and then Michael, and there, and there.
Okay, Jason, you mentioned that the Supreme Court tends to disregard the social science. What is the social science on this? What is the general population doing these things? Think about whether or not the regulation should be done.
Well, that sort of opinion research, and I sort of use that is that it's a lot of it's based on generation, but most people it's usually a majority of people think there's too much indecency on TV, sort of too much sex, too much violence, too much profanity. As far as the social science, what the Supreme Court dismisses is a lot of the effects research, especially on the side of regulation of violence in video games, where it's the social science has shown with a little more clarity that, especially for children, that that consume violent material tend to be more violent. And as you get older, that seems to not be the case. It's more of a desensitization, more susceptible to violence. As far as sexuality, the same thing. More people watch sexuality, their beliefs about it change. And kids that watch sex tend to be more promiscuous and more likely to engage in sexual activity. But as far as violence, the Supreme Court has dismissed the social science, but with sexuality, because we have this history of obscenity laws, they're more willing to accept it.
So you set up an interesting conundrum here, and you sort of talk around it, but I want to see if you can get to it. And it seems like the arguments here are fairly clear that Fox has done. As David said, the political environment is pretty clear that there's political traction to be gained by upholding these kinds of regulations. It makes the government look good. They're probably not going to lose those, etc. So is this a huge miscalculation by Fox? Why do you think Fox would spend the money to take this all the way to the Supreme Court if the political realities are that they're going to lose? Are they just spending this money because they want more clarity? I'm just interested in your opinion.
The broadcasters have always chafed on the double standard. They always have. For the same reasons I got the Playboy Channel calls. They know ratings are driven by hot issues and hot stuff. And if you cuss and show skin, you'll get more ratings. So it is a money issue. The fact that their programming is under these restrictions and all their competitors aren't. And so, yeah, they're going to keep pushing it as they have inches, along the way, because their advertisers are fleeing to the internet. They're behind the 8 ball. They know that, violence, if it bleeds, it leads. If you show skin or cuss, that drives up your ratings and gets you advertisers. They hate to be behind the 8 ball of the cable and the satellite in that respect, and it is a money issue. It's worth appealing. It's worth appealing to see if they can go out there further the way their other media competitors are able to do. It is a money issue, and they will keep appealing it, in my view.
And it started as fleeting expletives. And the original case in 2007 was, could the FCC change the rule? They never banned fleeting expletive before, and then they changed it tenfold penalty. So I think it was more about if they could get the Supreme Court to say that was arbitrary and capricious, which would have been easier to do than this whole constitutionality. I don't think that was necessarily the original intent of the broadcast station. It was that fleeting expletive rule change that they were trying to nix.
So in fact, they do want more.
Yes, without a doubt. Well, I think if they could have it their way, they'd like to win. But
Because I think that given that the ownership here is as invested in cable as it is in broadcast, they're making much more of their revenue on the cable side than broadcast, right? They have plenty of other platforms that they can turn to push that content out there. So they're not really restricted from distributing it, right? But I think your point about clarity about what they, particularly in an uncontrolled situation like the Grammy Awards, right? That then we have a interesting but very narrow question.
yeah.
And that the public perception of this issue may be much out of proportion with the reality of what we're trying to arbitrate.
I want to put just one small point out there, just that when we talk quickly about the very small percentage of this is broadcast television. I mean, it's the elderly, poor, the economically and minorities, and I think the elderly, I think about their
the digital migration, the government just couldn't wait any longer for the fact that when you split out the spectrum digitally, you suddenly end or get rid of a lot of the spectrum problems. You get rid of the scarcity argument to a certain extent by splitting it out that way. But the broadcasters, you're absolutely right. They've had that preferred position. They have been the repository of the public trust. They have occupied that pole position since the 1920s and 30s, and dislodging them from that, it is happening. It is happening, but they're doing a spectacular job holding on to that pole position, working with Hollywood on content, and to some extent, keeping the deference they've enjoyed. My own view, it's eroding. I think Caryn's paper is very interesting in that respect, showing all of the holes in self-regulation there. I mean, the fact that, we keep talking about self-regulation. What do we have? I mean, it's a lot of it is spotty. And so if broadcast wins these First Amendment rights, I would bet their self-regulation would be similar to some of the case studies you indicated.
And I think in terms of protecting a preferred position for broadcast networks, the majority of the audience is still on broadcast network primetime broadcast network television is where the top-rated programming is. And I'm not saying that cable doesn't produce shows that can be competitive, but for the most part, the most money is invested in broadcast network programming. The most viewers watch it, although the universe is fragmenting in terms of the various options available. I mean, broadcast continues to be the center of the universe. Did you want to jump in there too?
Well, she's talking about the public interest, and I just think it's funny that the FCC uses the public interest argument for indecency, but yet if you look at FCC reports in other areas of localism and news or minority ownership, all of a sudden some of the things that the FCC is not doing well as far as pushing in broadcasting, they sort of, public interest is being served. All of a sudden indecency rules come up, and all of a sudden, this is in the public interest. So, you sort of use it as you like.
To me, this is a good question, but I'm not so perfect. To me, that gets back to David's point about that indecency is what gets you votes. It's not sexy to be like, we need more minority ownership and local news, localism in broadcasting. The public is like, whatever. But yeah, no boobies on TV. That I get that. My question is actually for Caryn, and it's about your skins example, which I thought was really interesting.
Yes.
In highlighting that, that there are many more forces that shape what kind of content you get on broadcasting and cable than some of the ones you usually think about, advertising and, there's public advocacy groups and things like that. I mean, I was thinking, maybe MTV doesn't usually care because if someone shows up for skins, they'll stick around for Jersey Shore and,
Right.
And that's more valuable. And MTV is so valuable in the cable universe that, Comcast is going to stop offering MTV because it's skins. So.
And MTV actually set that up in the opposite relationship. They had the premiere of Jersey Shore that led all the viewers into the premiere of Skins, right? But I think what was particularly upsetting about it from the perspective of parents groups was that MTV has been very open about the fact that their audience target is 12 to 24-year-olds. That's who they're looking for. And even as the audience dwindled for Skins, they continued to air it. Apparently, their numbers were indicating that it was 12 to 17-year-olds who were sticking around. And in addition, MTV was designing a sort of an immersive address to them through online content, encouraging teens to share their stories about experimentation with sex and drugs. It was almost as though they were attempting to fuel the fire. The Parents Television Council had tried to bring them up on charges for child pornography because they had minor actors who were nude. They were lobbying the Attorney General. They were asking Congress to investigate the show and exactly what was going on there. And what's interesting is amidst all of this, MTV's like, no, we're going to stick with it. We'll just keep airing it. We'll just air the whole thing. Even if nobody's watching, even if we have no advertisements besides promos for our other programming, we'll just continue to air the show.
Yeah, and, my students and I talked about it a lot last spring. And we talked about the fact that actually all of the drama that the PTC was dredging up actually drove more kids to the show. 'Cause they were
Yes.
like, hey,
Yes.
You know, and we talked about the Gossip Girl campaign that used the lines from the PTC complaint as
Yes.
their advertising.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like the worst show on television. Do not let your kids watch this. Was the campaign for Gossip Girl the following year? You know, and so the fact that like all of that drama is actually serving the interests of the cable channel or the CW.
Yes.
I just think it's super.
You need to not forget that the FCC regulations don't say that the broadcast stations can't have teenagers having sex. They don't require that they talk about consequences
Yes.
of sex or safe sex. All they require is they don't say the 7 dirty words and they don't show nudity. So it's sort of futile to begin with.
Just wondering, what does it say about societal trends that those shows don't succeed? That in spite of all of that marketing, that food marketing, shows survive and also because of shows well.
No, I think it's absolutely interesting. And the sort of central contention of multiple public advocacy groups, not just the Parents Television Council, but the central contention is, perhaps if producers thought about making general audience programming, things that people would actually want to watch, we wouldn't have these issues in the first place. And so we wouldn't have to have a discussion about, how you took a British drama about teen sex and imported it to the United States in order to generate an audience based on controversy, right? Instead, you could have a successful show that's appealing to a general audience. I think that what you're describing seems to be the last control that's in place. What we measure, or the kinds of measurements that we get from Nielsen ratings and what they indicate about who's watching, have the power to keep a show on the air or to take it off. But again, as things fragment and audiences get smaller and smaller, those measures and their significance changes as well.
Maybe another factor where probably these words are becoming blurred, not obsolete, but where's the liberal opinion on all this? I mean, that seems like a problem too. It's like, where are the liberal? Where's the? I don't actually know. I should ask where, let's say, the ACLU might be on this issue, the Fox case. It just seems like, just as there's no legislator who could suffer from passing a law in favor of indecency regulation, there is no liberal group that wants to come out in favor of getting rid of those. Besides the industry.
Right.
I mean, so it's the industry. Nobody wants to kind of affiliate with that because we're in this era where other kinds of, it's like the last hold that the public seems to have, in the regulatory arena in some ways. So like, where's the liberal? Where's it going?
You're very right. I think the ACLU has cognitive dissonance about going in and starting to defend the right of the FCC to censor this stuff.
I think it's the difference between the libertarian and the liberal view.
Yeah.
I mean, Tipper Gore, and
Yeah.
she was one of the biggest proponents of the rating system back in the 90s. So liberal and Democrat, they had the same voters' parents as well.
As long as you're on the subject of political economy, it just strikes me that the corporations, which are inherently, by nature, very conservative, and so the same people that they're supporting politically are quote unquote denying them their free speech rights. Am I right? Accurate? Be careful what you wish for. Is that what it is?
I would comment that to some extent the communications industry is highly consolidated. As the number of outlets increases, the number of companies owning those outlets completely diminishes. My own view is you're going to have two duopolies running all media here in the next 10 years. You're going to have the cable TV guys, Time Warner, Comcast here, and then you'll have the wireless guys, AT&T and Verizon Wireless here. Those are the four companies going to be running media in this country, but that's a different thing. I think the cognitive dissonance is very true. They wall it off. It's compartmentalized, and if you're making money and returning shareholder value, you do that in many instances, as Mr. Murdoch might and his sons might tell you, by racing to the bottom and by being controversial and by doing these other things. If you return shareholder value because of the saturation of all this stuff, a lot of the more socially conservative doesn't mean they're, that translates over to the profit side. And as Walt Whitman said, do we contradict ourselves? We contradict ourselves. I contain worlds. I contain islands. I can contradict myself as much as possible as long as I'm making money. Walt Whitman said it.